well.
Yes,
On
yes. Now, if I could sort of lead you on to what has clearly become a great passion of magnolias, and just wondering what it is about magnolias that's particularly drawn you to them.
Well, I suppose when I first went, I was a student, as I mentioned, at the Great Park and Royal Gardens at Windsor.
Mm.
And as an impressionable 18-year-old, I'd obviously seen in our village, I was brought up in South Gloucestershire,
Yeah,
and
yes.
we obviously had magnolias in gardens throughout in the village. But when I went to Windsor, and in the late 60s, I was just blown over by the sheer power of tree magnolias in the Great Park. If you go to Savile Garden and also into the Valley Gardens as well, you see huge tree magnolias, which I'd never witnessed before, and that passion for
Yes.
seeing and growing magnolias and wanting to know more
Yes.
has lasted with me from that day to this. I can still remember there's a magnolia called the Magnolia with the telephone number, which is a Magnolia campbelli molicumata that George Forrest introduced from southern Yunnan in the 1920s. And there's various three forms of it, one called Lanarth, one called Werrington, and one called Bord Hill.
Yes, yes.
And it's after the Forest collection number 25655.
Yeah.
They all had the 5-figure telephone numbers in the old days.
Yes, yes.
and the colour, it was just absolutely phenomenal. And I remember when it was first exhibited at Vincent Square, I think even during the Second World War, people were just blown over by it, taking it to almost a vintage port in colour.
Yes.
So from there, I suppose this lasting impression on magnolias has grown upwards and outwards, as it were.
Yes.
And there's an enormous, and I do mean that, an enormous community who are interested in magnolias.
Yes.
There's two main societies. There's one which the RHS has, the Rhododendron Community Magnolia group of the RHS, which is generally speaking British-based, but there's a Magnolia Society International, which was formed in the 1960s in the United States, and they asked me to become its first overseas president, because by and large all the people that had held office were American. And it grew exponentially, and it has members in over 30 countries around the world.
Wow. Yes. So in the first picture here, we've got two of these American arboretum locations, but also Carhays Castle in Cornwall and Nyman's in Sussex. And the image of magnolias in Britain has tended to be rather associated with this rather kind of aristocratic expanses of land. I mean, they're big trees, they take a very long time to grow. And so they've always had this rather sort of aristocratic image. But obviously in the nursery trade there's been quite a drive to produce smaller plants and ones that flower more reliably earlier. And you've shown some images here of the Little Girls series, which to me looked like an attempt to kind of more democratise the magnolia. And these were bred in the United States, I think, weren't they?
Yes, Little Girls are so called because they were bred by William Cosar and Francis DeVos, who were two geneticists who worked for the U.S. National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. That's an amazing garden, U.S. National Arboretum, full of interesting woody plants. And these two gentlemen in the 1950s bred, used Magnolia liliflora and Magnolia stellata, and they were called Little Girls because they were named after either their wives or secretaries or their daughters. And so I think I've highlighted Susan, Pinky, Betty, and Judy, and what's good about them is they flower a little later than Magnolias stellata, which is one of its parents. Liliflora itself, it comes from Japan, Korea, and China, and it flowers with the foliage sporadically from literally the end of April, May, in June, and you find flowers occurring a little later on.
Yes.
But it's a really good parent, because if you look at any magnolias that are in growth and they've got almost a sickle-shaped bud, almost certainly it's got Liliflora in its parentage somewhere along the line.
Right. Yes.
And so they flower a little later, and they're compact. And if you go to the US National Arboretum today, I must admit, for about 20 years, but when I saw them, they were 50 years old then. They were very nice, compact growing plants, rounded in habit, probably as tall as they were broad. And they remain very compact and very floriferous in this country today. I should say that there's probably, if you think about it, there's about over 300 species of magnolia.
Yes.
And they are very ancient plants. They originally started, interestingly, in North America and worked their way south and eastward, as opposed to starting off in China.
Oh,
and
right.
There's roughly about 160 species in Asia and 160 species in North America and Canada, and also down through Central America and into South America as well.
Yes. Now, that number of species, my impression is, if I'm correct, that's actually rather dramatically increased, because in our next picture we've got Magnolia laeviflora, which is, I believe, one of those that used to be classified as a Michaelia. Now, Michaelia is now included in Magnolia, isn't it?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Yes.
There's two genera in Magnoliaceae, Magnolia and Liriodendron. And there's about 16 sections of Magnolia, and Michaelia is one of those. Magnesia is another one, Eulania, Magnolia, and so it goes on. For instance, if you were going to, there's been a huge amount of what I call DNA sequencing and molecular systematics being done.
Yes.
By some various friends over the years, Hans Nutelblum and in particular Dick Figler, who's an American, and they've analysed it, and they this is the findings, and this has been, I suppose, explored more thoroughly and concreted more, because there's the ability of all these different sections to hybridize in cultivation is evident.
Yes.
If you actually look in the wild, there's very, very little overlap in species.
Oh, really?
Where there is an overlap, you do get hybridization. But generally speaking, in the wild, you don't get hybridity taking place.
Oh, that's interesting.
I've been to one place in Japan where Magnolia stellata comes from the central island of Honshu, and then as you progress more or less up the mountainside, you get more or less fairly high up Magnolia cobus, but also in between you get some solicifolia, which is the willow leaf magnolia, and Miki Norio Gisu and a great nurseryman, Suji Yamaguchi, showed me the site where Magnolia proctriana is actually found in the wild.
Yes.
They showed me this lovely, small, upright tree, and with a delicate pink in bud opening pure white. But by and large, they don't hybridize in the wild.
No. So this Magnolia laeviflora then is one of these ones that used to be called Michaelia, and it's the sort of thing you perhaps only see really in Cornish gardens. But in your next picture, you've got some magnolias that's But in your next picture, you've got some magnolias that are being grown as potential street trees. And actually, this is one of the joys about being in Portugal at this time of year is magnolias as street trees. And even towns that are quite kind of ordinary in many ways may have some fantastic young magnolias, which really add something hugely to the atmosphere of the urban environment. So, is this a growing trend elsewhere, do you think?
Oh, very much so. Which magnolias are grown as street trees in Portugal? Does it tend to be the evergreen Magnolia grandiflora?
No, it's very much the early spring flowering deciduous types.
Yeah. That's great to hear. I have a friend called Zach Soniol who looks after all the local authority parks in Nantes in northern France. And he's using Magnolia yellow lantern as a street tree, as is another colleague in Malmo in Sweden. He's using Magnolia yellow lantern as a street tree there.
How interesting.
But also in London, there's a number of galaxies being used as street trees, which is fantastic, really. They're really extremely accommodating, and they've got a really good upright habit as well.
Yes.
And because of their floristic qualities, especially when you've got the influence of shall we say, the microclimate of the city, they're protected. If you go back to the original, I suppose the most popular one they're protected. If you go back to the original, I suppose the most popular one in the UK, Magnolia Soulangeana, everywhere you go in suburbia, you always see Soulangeana being grown.
Yes.
But Soulangeana itself has been hybridized over the years. You've got numerous selections. You've got white, and you've got pink, and you've got purple. You've got goblet-shaped and tulip-shaped flowers, but also you've got various habits as well. For instance, you've got a potential street tree in the form of Picard Schmetterling, which is a really good upright grower.
Yes.
But also you've got a really nice compact grower called Magnolia Genie, which was raised in New Zealand, which is ideal for the smaller garden.
Right. Yes.
And so, as street trees, absolutely, and I'm sure that there's there's a really great selection that can be utilised for that particular purpose.
Yes. Now, it's interesting, though, you saying they were using them in Malmo, which in Sweden, which is being the most extraordinarily adventurous city in many ways. Some incredible perennial plantings being developed in new areas to the south of the city, in Limhamn, the old sort of limestone and cement works quarrying area. A very, very interesting city indeed. So I think Soulangeana types are the ones that really most of us are familiar with. Usually it's a fairly broad tree, so it's interesting to hear about more upright ones as well. And then, of course, these smaller ones, for traditionally Stellata being the favoured one for small gardens. But I'm glad to see you've got a picture here of Leonard Messel, which was the one that we had in our last garden in Herefordshire, which I must say is the most fantastic plant. It's that much bigger than Stellata, so it makes more of a sort of tree shape, but not that big. But I'm surprised Leonard Messel isn't more widely grown, because it's just such a wonderful performer, such a great shade of pink.
It is. I would say that if you look at the sales of Leonard Messel, they are very good indeed.
Good.
Leonard Messel, of course, he was the owner of Nyman's Gardens, and there is this great linkage between Nyman's and Borde Hill, and also if you go down to Wakehurst Place, but also to Leonard's Lee, and there's this, and over to Exbury, and there's this great linkage of these people, these great estates, and The original Leonard Messel, which is over 100 years old, is still there in Lymond.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yes.
It was a chance seedling, and it's more or less still there where it became a chance seedling. There's a number of plants in that area, because Lebneri is a hybrid between Magnolia cobus and Magnolia stellata, both Japanese species. But stellata itself varies between the number of tepals it has,
yes.
anything from 6'8" right way up to 16, 18. But when you hybridize it with cobus,
yes.
you get almost an explosion of the number of tepals.
Right. Yes.
With some of the new ones, such as Wildcat, it's got 52 tepals.
Wow.
Whereas the one that I think is quite remarkable is one called Mag's Pirouette.
Yes.
And it's the flower is very much like a gardenia-like. It opens almost cup-shaped, and then it splays open. But it's got a large number of delicate pure white tepals.
Yes.
A beautiful plant, really ideal for the small garden.
Yes. And then, of course, as we move on, there are various species that flower sort of early summer. Then really we end up with these, the grandiflora types, which we essentially grow as foliage plants and with flowers as a sort of added extra produced later in the summer. And Magnolia grandiflora, we're sort of mostly familiar with it in Britain as a classic situation up against the south-facing wall of a late 18th century house. But increasingly, I think I was wondering whether we're going to be seeing cultivars selected for foliage. And I remember I had this extraordinary experience about 7 or 8 years ago of going to somebody in North Carolina to see somebody who was making wreaths out of Magnolia grandiflora leaves, which is a real traditional thing in the American South. These wreaths will dry and then they'd last for, probably a good few years, and they actually go for quite a bit of money. So I turned up at this nursery, and this was one of the most untidiest, most sordid nurseries I think I've ever been to. It was unbelievable squalor. I think her father had some sort of fish farming business, and there were kind of old sort of fish tanks everywhere and net and just piles and piles of rubbish. But amongst all this crap were growing these incredible Magnolia grandiflora cultivars with the most perfect foliage imaginable, often quite smaller than the classic leaf and incredibly lustrous and shiny and wonderfully rich undersides to the foliage, and just really, really beautiful foliage, but all kind of emerging out of this complete chaos. So are we going to be seeing more of these types in Britain, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. There's about 100 named cultivars of grandiflora.
Really? Wow, as many as that.
And they vary. Some are really broad spreading, like the traditional ones that you expect against big southern homesteads.
Yes.
Whereas others are very much more compact and upright.
Mm-hmm.
And I sent you a picture of Kevin Paris. He bred one called K. Paris, named after his mother. Mm-hmm. And it's a very good, compact grower, comparatively small flower, but he's got a really nice upright habit. And I think that, and then there's others like Little Gem, and there's others, T.D. Blanchard and Alta. These are really good, strong, upright growers, and they are tolerant of what I call potentially adverse temperature conditions.
Yes.
If you go they will tolerate very high temperatures, but they'll also tolerate low temperatures as well. I'm not saying that they will you can grow them widely in places like Chicago, but where you do get really low temperatures. But what I call the traditional temperature that you find, winter temperature that you find in this country, they will certainly tolerate.
Yes.
It's things like really at the end of the day, you've got to have the summer heat, which tends to be found more generally in the south of
Yes.
this country.
Yes. Yes.
But in terms of those characteristics, I think that a great friend, John Ravenscroft, who has got an arboretum in near Bridgemere, he's established 300 different types of magnolias there, and he's identified the fact that you can grow a wide range of magnolias on heavy clay soils as well as you can on light acid sand soils.
That's good to hear. So in your last picture, you've got some hybrids of Magnolia sprengeri, which, I mean, for me, as I think with a lot of people, one we tend to associate more with kind of sheltered Cornish gardens. But so what are the new hybrids of this got to offer us?
Magnolia sprengeri, well, Galaxy and Spectrum are two plants that you find in London as street trees.
Oh, yeah.
It's called Magnolia sprengeri. It's a goddess magnolia, and it comes from Hubei and parts of Sichuan, but Hubei and Jiangxi provinces of China. And it was introduced by Ernest Wilson under the collection number of Wilson 688. And when he was collecting for the famous Veitch and Company, and this seed batch was germinated, and when Veitch's famous closing down sale occurred in 1913, there's about a dozen seedlings. Some were bought by Kew, some were bought by Aberconway at Bodnant, and one was bought by a person called J.C. Williams of Carhaix.
Of course, yes.
And all of them, with the exception of Williams's, were white, which is Sprengeri elongator. Whereas his one was a most magnificent pink. And because of its vibrancy of colour, he called it the goddess magnolia. And it's gone on to be a really great seed parent. And you've got a number of really first-class forms of Sprengeri being cultivated. Marwood Spring, as an example, from North Devon, but also Lanhydrock, which is a great Cornish garden. And there's one called Eric Saville obviously in the Saville Garden. But they are very prolific in flower, and there's another one called Copeland Court, and they're absolutely beautiful in colour. But also, as I said, they are also produced. They also are really good as seed parents, and you get another generation of beautiful pink flowered plants.
Right. So a very rich and diverse genus, clearly one that's going places, and I think it's good news. We'll be seeing many more magnolias as urban environment trees. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for that. I'm sure we've been much more aware now of the potentials of magnolias. Well, I hope you enjoy your retirement and don't get too busy, and very much enjoying your new garden.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Noel. Pleasure to speak to you about magnolias, and hopefully it will generate more interest in this particular genus.
Okay, Jared Barnes wants to know, did you say that the origin of the magnolia was in North America? Was he correct?
Absolutely, yes. It's there's a species of magnolia that was found in as fossil records by Dick Figler in Moscow, Idaho. Wow. And it's about 35 million years ago. And you find that's basically the epicenter of where magnolias came from. And then over the millennia, they either went south or they went east across Europe. And so all the circumpolar, if you look into the clays of the London clays, for example, you'll find Magnolia cobus pollen. Wow. And along with Cerstiphyllum and ginkgo as well.
Lovely.
But there's there's inevitably a huge number of both evergreen and deciduous magnolias, and they are all around the Northern Hemisphere.
Fantastic. Another question is, Montse says she's got a young Magnolia Soulangiana. She's just planted 3 years ago, but it's very thin and high. Can she cut back the main stem to get it to encourage it to bush out?
Magnolias are very well. They can take pruning extremely well. With deciduous magnolias, if it's a bit thin, you can do some formative pruning. Later on in the summer, in the UK, I would do that in probably early September. However, if you're wanting to have an established plant that you're wanting to reduce in size, you can prune it immediately after flowering. Right. And they do take pruning extremely easily, and they're very tolerant of pruning.
Great. And then Dilip's asking any tips on magnolia species for rain gardens or swales, so sort of damp situations?
There's a number of species that are very tolerant, dependent on whereabouts is this.
Is Dilip? I'm not sure, Dilip, where you are. Can you just tap in where you are in the world and let us know?
He's London.
Right. Okay.
There is, if you're going to the United States, and you'll find that Magnolia virginiana is one of the swamp magnolias, and is very tolerant of moist conditions. Right. But you'll find that magnolias are dependent on how wet is. They are quite tolerant of.
Well, he's just chipped in to say that he is in London, but actually this is for an Irish project. So yeah.
Well, certainly the only location that John Ravenscroft cannot grow magnolias in his garden, which is at Bridgemere in Cheshire, is in the swamp. So it will tolerate very heavy clay soils.
Oh, good. Okay, another question is, what do deciduous magnolias need to bloom generously? And what about the ones that don't bloom at all? Okay, 2 different questions there. Somebody's obviously struggling to get some blooms on their magnolias. This is Eleanor Somalo.
At St Malo, you'll get magnolias to bloom really well in northern France. And
oh no, her name is Eleanor Somalo. She's not in.
Oh,
San Malo,
I beg your pardon.
She might be in San Malo, right? Yeah.
I think that inevitably magnolias, deciduous magnolias, will set flower buds in August and September. So what you've got to do is you've got to get good growth the year before, and you'll get flower buds setting. Right. And if you've got an evergreen magnolia, again, you tend to find that they will be setting flower buds in the UK from May, June onwards, right way through September, October. But it's the sun levels, it's sunshine that they'll be looking for, to set flower buds, and ripening of the wood.
Right. And then this is a question from me. pH, how, always a little bit nervous about pH, and especially where we are in the southeast here on chalky places. I mean, what do you think about, the pH significance?
There's a misconception that magnolias can only grow on acid soils. And certainly they grow to perfection on moist, moisture retentive soil, but they are quite tolerant of alkaline conditions as well. Provided this is moisture retentive. Right. There's a person that used to be who had a garden in Northamptonshire, and he had both acid and alkaline conditions, and he found very little difference between the two.
Oh, that's interesting. So really, it's the moisture that's the more important of everything, really, and a good rich soil. Yeah, that's wonderful. Great. Have we got any other questions? I think I've gone through questions that people have had. Has anybody got any final questions that we could, or general questions for Jim? It would be good to hear them. We've had a rather tricky time with sound before you arrived, Jim. We should have got you in earlier, but of course we weren't planning on getting you in live on Zoom. So that's why, if people are wondering why we pre-recorded bits, that was the reason why. So luckily it leveled out and we overcame it. So
whereabouts is everyone from?
We've had northeastern states, Birmingham, Alabama, Hester's in Cork. We've got people in France, Italy. Some new messages coming in. East Texas, Jared's in East Texas, Scotland, Spain, Milan. All over.
No one from Japan or Chile today, though.
I don't know. Ottawa, where it snowed last night. Sorry about that, Meg. The Baltics. Wow, wonderful. Chester.
Pacific Northwest.
Wonderful. Oh, well, thank you so much, all of you, for sticking with it. Yeah. With our dodgy sound system to start with. It's a good job it wasn't our first day today, or we'd have put everything.
That would have put us off. Yes.
Yeah, sometimes these things happen. But yeah. So any more? Right. There's another question that's come in. Companion underplanting that would suit magnolias, Jim, and this is from Alison Condy.
And whereabouts are you, Alison?
Alison, where are you? Can you quickly type in your where you are? She all right, no, there's enough. Well, while Alison's typing in where she is, Joe Selman is saying, what is your favorite yellow magnolia? We'll come back to Alison.
Well, there's three favorite yellows. There is one called Lois. There's another one called Daphne.
Right.
And there's an orange one called Judy Zook. Those are my top three.
Called Judy Zook. Judy Zook.
Yes.
Oh, after the singer.
Yes.
Okay.
She was just an amazing lady. She used to be the president of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden a number of years ago, and unfortunately she died far too young. The
same woman who was the singer?
No.
Oh, right. That's extraordinary. Right, okay. Right, now we now know where Alison's from. She's up in Merseyside and she's on sandy soil, I think she says. Did I read that correctly? Merseyside, yes. Yeah.
That's
sandy coast, yeah.
Oh, and she's wanting some underplanting.
Yes, yeah.
I've seen magnolias being underplanted with spring bulbs, and I've also seen them underplanted with cyclamen as well.
Oh, right.
And so you can have hedropholium and coum, and
right.
you can get 6-7 months of interest by using those.
And Jared also said he's interested in the underplanting question because he's heard that magnolias don't like their roots disturbed. Is that right?
Well, up to a point. You'll find that magnolias do have very thick, fleshy roots. Mm-hmm. And certainly where I used to live, in Wisley, we had lots of Geranium cantabrigiense underneath, and we also had herbaceous peonies. And they seem to flourish okay.
Well, now Erin Keegan, who I know is in Pennsylvania, has said, lovely broadcast, lots of information, and she has 2 immature Judy Zook waiting for her first blooms this year. So let's keep fingers crossed that they bloom. That's wonderful. So I think
it's a great plant, and I'm sure they won't let her down.
Yeah, and I think we also at this point, because we've got you here, Jim, ought to say that unfortunately the event that we'd organised with you and Mary Louise Agius for Expiry, we've had to cancel, and that's partly because we were going to postpone it. Partly because your diary is like no other diary I've ever met. I mean, you are the busiest man on. I'd like to know what you do, because you're the busiest man in the world. But also, Mary Louise was really, really keen that we do it in spring at Rhodo time. So at the moment, anybody who was booked for Expiry in May, we're going to do it in early May next year. So watch this space. But we will get there, and we will have Jim, and we'll have Mary Louise and the head gardener at Expiry as well.
I'm really looking forward to that. Expiry is one of the great gardens, not only of this country, but the world.
Well, it is. And in fact, Mary Louise is going to do one of these tea time talks, and her latest toy is a what do you call it? A drone. So she's been taking drone footage of Exbury. So it's going to be quite an interesting talk, that, and it's specifically on rhodos as well. So she's compiling all the wonderful rhodos that are flowering at the moment.
These drones are fantastic tools to use, especially when you have all these great gardens in lockdown at the moment.
Yeah.
If anyone, I'm sure most people do know a great garden in eastern United States called Mount Cuba.
Yeah.
Look on their website. It's got all this amazing drone footage of taking people around the garden.
Yeah. Jim, what are your favourite handful of gardens? Is that like asking someone to choose their favourite child? I know we're all in lockdown, but where would you be going now if you had the gate open and you could escape?
Well, I live in Sussex, as you do, and we are absolutely well blessed with gardens. Yeah. And we've obviously got Board Hill and Lyman and Wakehouse Place just down the road. But inevitably, I started my career, professional career, at Windsor in the late 1960s. And what an amazing series of gardens there are there. But you just have to go all around. You just have to go all around this country and find fantastic gardens. Yeah. But I've been to gardens in North America, which are absolutely wonderful. Also gardens in Switzerland, in northern Italy, and you go to. I used a friend was Otto Eisenhut, and his son now has taken over his nursery in Ticino, and what an amazing site, full of magnolias there, and you get blown away by their power. But you go down to North Island, New Zealand, and you find Mark and Abbey Jury, and they've got a great garden full of magnolias amongst other things.
Yeah, wonderful, brilliant. Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining us live, and thank you for rescuing us actually from our sound, our ghost in the machine that we had today. It's been lovely having you here, and lovely speaking. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, great to see you.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody who attended, and thank you to everyone who stuck with us through the thick and the thin today. Join us again tomorrow. Looking forward to seeing you. Amber's still in her greenhouse. I can see you, Amber. Give us a wave. Brilliant. I just think you're amazing. That's women multitasking absolutely brilliantly. Well done. Anyway, yes. So we'll see everybody tomorrow. And Jim, we look forward to having an event with you next year. Very much so.
Brilliant. Yes, so do I. And great good wishes to everyone who's been listening in today. And if they haven't been able to understand, tough.
Oh, you're a hard man. Well, listen, stay safe, everybody, and join us tomorrow, because we've got a really lovely day lined up tomorrow as well. So all the best, and take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.